Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar this afternoon. A Declaration of Liberation, Building a Racially Just and Strategic Domestic HIV Movement. This webinar is brought to you by the Interim Steering Committee of HIV Racial Justice Now. And we are so grateful that all of you have decided to join us on what we hope will be an informative webinar. So to introduce myself, I will be your moderator today. My name is Johnny Ray Cornegay III. I am one of the Interim Steering Committee members, and I am the Mobilization and Network Director for the Counter Narrative Project. Joining me later on in the webinar will be two panelists, both Interim Steering Committee members. I will be joined by Cecilia Chung, as well as Vanita Ray. And we are grateful and looking forward to chatting later and having a panel discussion. So for our agenda today, we will talk about what is HIV Racial Justice Now? I know that that has been a question, and we're going to answer that for you today. We are going to define racial justice as we see it. We are going to talk about why a racial justice framework is important to the HIV movement. We will talk about what specifically the HIV Racial Justice Now framework is. Talk a bit about how we implement the framework as a belief system. We will talk a bit about some of the demands that we've included in the framework. And as I just mentioned, we will have a panel discussion between myself and two of our Interim Steering Committee members. And we will open it up for some questions at the end. So what is HIV Racial Justice Now? Well, HIV Racial Justice Now started as a group of over 20 leaders of color in the HIV movement. We initially convened in July of 2017, so we just celebrated a year. And we convened with the support of the Ford Foundation and the Elton John AIDS Foundation. The group currently meets on a monthly basis, and we're still in our forming stages for HIV Racial Justice Now, but we do meet on a monthly basis. And but we have installed our interim steering committee comprised of initial individuals who convened in 2017. So I did get a question that came in, and I do want to be sure that everyone can hear me. So let me double check on that. So we are following up. Give me 1 second. Okay, so it looks like our sound is working. Thank you so much for that confirmation. All right, so what is racial justice? Racial justice, as we define it, is the collective practice of people of color and allies to identify, dismantle, and heal from the many external and internal harms of structural and institutional racism. This practice invites us to collaborate across all communities of color in service of dismantling white supremacy and building power. And we envision a movement premised on solidarity, collaboration, and coalition. You will hear that a lot as we talk through some of the different components of this. But once again, we envision a movement premised on solidarity, collaboration, and coalition. So why is a racial justice framework important for the HIV movement? Well, it's our assertion that any response to the impact of HIV must be rooted in racial justice. We believe that we can't end the HIV epidemic if we don't address and grapple with racial injustices experienced by Black and brown bodies. So it is important that we view our movement through a racial justice lens. So we do believe that in these times, these politically charged times, that it is important for us to have a place to create what is needed for us to promote true health equity and end the epidemic. So we really do value the opportunity to come together so that we can create and build with one another as a unified movement. So what is the HIV Racial Justice Now framework? Well, first and foremost, if you look on the left side of your screen, you can write down this link, but the HIV Racial Justice Framework can be downloaded. So you can download the Racial Justice Framework at the link there. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and put that link in our chat box so everyone can copy and paste it. So it will appear there for you. But first and foremost, the framework is a document. The framework serves as a lens for analyzing our present moment and our future implications of the HIV movement. So first and foremost, the framework, like I said, is something that you can download, is a document and something that it is that you can read and use. But first and foremost, the framework is a document itself. The framework was drafted and edited by over 20 members of the interim steering committee. It was a very collaborative process of working together, not just when we convened in New York City for our initial convening, but it continued for several months after to actually develop the framework. So it did have input from everyone who's part of the interim steering committee. The framework itself is an expression of love. We crafted the framework and the conversations around it throughout the development of the framework, really beginning to think about what we needed to see in order to move the movement forward and to craft something that really spoke to what was needed to view our movement through a racial justice lens. And that started first with love. As well, and Vanita, you can put yourself on, you can take your video off, you can turn off your video and put yourself on mute. Thank you. All right. And the framework should be viewed as a first step. So you will listen to this call and we will have this conversation towards the end and you will wonder, okay, so what can I do? How can I implement this? And it really is a first step and should be viewed as such. So what you get from this, we're hoping, is an overview of what's in the framework, and then how you implement it really does depend on you. So please see that as such. So let's talk a bit about the framework itself and some of the things that are included within it. Sorry about that, I went too far back. Here we go. So we did title the framework A Declaration of Liberation, Building a Racially Just and Strategic HIV Movement. So here are some of the things that you can expect to see when downloading the framework itself. So we talk about the spirit of our community's legacies and how important it is for us to explore radical action to create the change that we seek, right? So many of us, so many of you who are joining us and many of us who are in the room recognize that we've been doing this work for a number of years, and there are certain things that you run up against, but then realizing that we need to really commit to explore radical action to create the change that we seek, and rooting that in the spirit of our community's legacies. We maintain that at the core of the true love, the love that we talked about, is accountability, right? So we talked about, really being able to start from that place. And at the core of that is that accountability. So that's the accountability to each other, right? So our accountability to one another, our accountability to our communities, and our accountability to our shared values. So in reading the framework document and being able to embody it, right? So this becomes a part of that accountability. So accountability to ourselves, accountability to the community as a whole, and then accountability to those values that we share. I'm going to stop clicking the button. So we recognize, right? So there are forces that are invested in forgetting that Black Lives Matter, right? There are forces that are invested in our forgetting that no human being is illegal, that healthcare, including comprehensive sexual and reproductive care, is a human right, regardless of your country of origin. It is important that we root and we work, and we talk about this in the framework, but we work from that place because we recognize that these forces exist. So it's important for us to embody it and then move forward. We recognize that we need to commit to developing and nurturing a leadership body in the HIV movement that reflects all the things that I've just described, that lifts Black and Brown leadership, and the centers the communities that are most impacted by the epidemic. And very clearly within this document, we state that we are not fragile. We are boundlessly powerful. I'm going to take a pause there before I move on to my next slide, because I want to let folks know if you are interested in asking questions, we will of course have the panel discussion that will start in a bit. If you are interested in asking questions, you can hit the Q&A button, which is down at the bottom of your screen. If you're joining from your phone, you can just probably tap your screen and that Q&A box should come up. So if you're interested in asking a question, please go down and click the Q&A button and you can ask your question there. Thank you. So we talked a bit about the framework itself and some of the core things that are within that framework. So the question is, okay, so how do we get there? So how do we do this? So when we think about implementing this framework, what are the things? Like, what are the things that we should be thinking about? So we include these things in the framework itself. So the recognition that culture is our strength, that we commit to embrace and engage in constructive conflict in our collective work, and we honor the wisdoms of our culture in the spirit of learning. We commit to addressing anti-Blackness. So we are committed to examining and eliminating anti-Blackness in our coalitions, in our movements, as well as within ourselves. So when we think about this framework, right, so we are talking about, okay, how do we implement the framework? How do we move it forward? How do we use it within our organizations? And for many of us, it starts with us and as individuals. So as we're going through this list, also be thinking about using this framework within a personal context, because that's where a lot of the change will come from as well. So it's not just organizational, it's also personal. So undoing the myth of exceptionalism within the US context. So being very clear, to talk about racial justice in the US context is also to talk about who we value as quote unquote American, right? So we're committed as part of our practice as HIV Racial Justice Now and this practice of racial justice to challenge those notions of American exceptionalism and really bring all of us who make up what quote unquote American is to the table. Another component is addressing systemic inequity. So it's root cause, we're committed to root cause analysis work. In fighting these systemic barriers. And we specifically call out, life, health, dignity, and the power for all of our communities. But when we think about this systemic inequity, it really does go into that root cause analysis and conversation. So that's another way that we get there. We also get there by dismantling racist institutions. So we acknowledge that we need to build alliances, trusting and with trustworthy individuals and trustworthy institutions, and work within those institutions that were never designed to uplift communities of color, right? We recognize that within that, there is an opportunity for us to build value and build trust and build with individuals. So dismantling racist institutions is an important part of how we implement the framework. So what does a racial justice lens mean for the HIV? What does a racial justice lens for the HIV movement demand from us? Like, what does this demand that we do? It demands that we integrate racial justice into our organizations and political strategies. So that's through our work. That is through when we are, meeting together and gathering. It is really integrating racial justice into all of the things that we do within organizations and within our political strategies. It also demands that we center those communities most impacted by the epidemic in leadership and decision-making. So MIPA 101, part of this is really central to what we demand for a racial justice lens in the HIV movement. We must root our efforts to advance a racial justice lens and accountability to the communities that we lead. So that goes directly back to centering those communities most impacted. We have to root our efforts in the movement, in the accountability to the communities that we lead. Fourth demand is that we must ensure equity around the allocation of resources. That's human, material, and financial. So that is looking at all of the places where we have to ensure that there's equity in each part of the movement. And finally, but certainly not last, right? So there are many things that is demanded of us in order to implement a racial justice lens into the movement. But our last thing that we have listed here is work to transform and, where necessary, dismantle institutions that uphold white supremacy and compromise the well-being of communities of color. So, in an effort to build upon conversation and how we should move forward, I do want to go ahead and start the panel portion of the conversation now. So I'm actually going to go ahead and invite two folks to join me. Let me see if we can get them off of mute. So I want to unmute Cecilia Chung and unmute Vanita Ray. Cecilia, can we hear you?
Yes, I hope so.
Yes, we can hear you. Vanita, let's see if we can hear you.
Hey, everybody.
Hey there. All right, so I am now being joined by Cecilia Chung and Vanita Ray, and I am going to give both of them an opportunity to formally introduce themselves, and I will move through a series of questions. So Cecilia, I'll start with you. If you could please introduce yourself and your role.
Hi, everyone. My name is Cecilia Chung, and I am working for Transgender Law Center based in Oakland, California. I started a project a couple of years ago that I'm still leading called Positively Trans, and hopefully many of you have seen us around in the community and at AIDS Watch last 2 years.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Cecilia. Vanita.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Vanita Ray. I live here in Houston, Texas. My most recent affiliation will be joining the Positive Women's Network August 16th. Join some folks to continue this work. I've been doing a lot of this work in Texas, locally, and some on a national level about building the leadership of people living with HIV, as well as getting our voices heard at policy level, and sometimes creating our own tables for that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Vanita. And I'm actually going to go ahead and start with you. So I have a few questions, everyone, that I'm going to ask our panelists. And each of them will get a chance to respond. And I do see that we have some questions coming in the Q&A box. Thank you so much. But I'm going to go ahead and, Vanita, I'm going to start with you and ask the first question. So when we consider, right, implementing a racial justice framework that's either individually or within our organizations, from your perspective, how do you see a racial justice lens making a difference in the community work and activities that you're a part of in the HIV movement?
Well, you know, and I know there's a lot of other folks out there who could answer some of this as well. Some of the biggest things for me, and the difference is, first of all, to push the conversation, to change the conversation. I've been in spaces either that others have created, Ryan White Planning Council or others, and we get to see the numbers that talk about Black folks this, Black women that, but we never get to really have the real discussion about why it's like that. And so it irritates me every time I see it, because it's just, you guys got the numbers, but no one's gonna talk about why. And I think if we can begin to have racial justice discussions and talks, we can kind of unpack why. You know, it's not just a group of us decided that we were the ones that decided we wanted to get HIV. There's more to the conversation, and especially, Johnny, you talked about looking at a root causal analysis. That's never comes up any place other than in our discussions. And when I say our, that means me, you, and the Racial Justice Steering Committee, where we acknowledge that HIV is the symptom, it's the leaf on the tree versus what's the root, what's at the root that causes that. And so when we do this work, we get a chance to push the envelope, we get the chance to change the conversation, and really get to look at some of those social and structural barriers and some of those other reasons. And it's not just about what the data says. I want people to talk about, why does the data say that? So if we're really looking at root cause analysis, we need to dig deeper, and I don't think that happens enough. And I love the more we have to talk about race, not just race, racial justice, it can force a conversation about where's the justice and what else do we need to be talking about.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Vanita. And Cecilia, I would like to give you the opportunity to pick up that question of, how do you see this racial justice lens making a difference in the community work that you do in the HIV movement?
I think that for the work that I've done so far, I begin to recognize that when we talk about racial justice and even gender justice, we can't do the work without really framing it as the equity issues, as well as looking at, if they are represented in the conversations. Like Vanita say, a lot of times when we look at these movement and, and trying to center around racial justice, we hear a lot of people talking about it, but we don't see that many people of color being part of that movement. So I think that it's important to really adapt the JIPA and MIPA principles, that if we are going to apply the racial justice lens, then we should have more conversations led by people of color in the movement.
Yes.
Amazing. And I think that leads perfectly into practical application, right? So, one of the things we talk about a great deal is what the framework is, how we've kind of laid it out. Can you identify, Cecilia, one or two, you don't have to go too far into it, but one or two ways that you can see this racial justice lens, this framework, being applied to spaces and communities in which you work?
That's something that, first of all, our organizations, Transgender Law Centers, have been like doing a lot of work around that, including, you know, like our own best practices. So the lens, when we apply it, it means that we have to look at, you know, the diversity of the organizations in terms of the leaderships, and the staff compositions, as well as, you know, like sometimes, you know, like we go deeper and look at our donor base. What we are hoping to achieve, and I think that that's really crucial, is that we would have a majority of people of color in leadership positions. And also we would have like opportunities for people of color to get on staff. And in terms of donors, you know, like this is a grassroots movement. If we don't get the buy-in from the communities of color, then we're probably not doing things right. And, you know, and that would be giving us an indicator, you know, to change our approach or to look at what other policy to adapt. And it's also important to know that Vanita said that earlier again, you know, about the root causes. And, you know, and so some of the root causes, which include criminalizations, which means that we have to take a strong stance against criminalizations. And, you know, and for us, we take a stance against criminalizations of like all forms, because we don't want to create more opportunities for people to fill the prison pipeline, but instead we want to see, you know, like justice being restored in other alternative ways.
Bravo.
Thank you so much for that. Cecilia, you could go ahead, Vanita.
Oh no, Cecilia
Okay.
said a lot there. I guess I would agree. Some of the places that I like to see this lens being applied, definitely in staffing. If you are, you know, whether you be ASO or whatever kind of service providers, and you are serving primarily folks who don't work for you, I really think that's a problem, and we need to take a step back and ask why and why not. Not only in the staffing, our funders. Remember when, you know, when we take money, we're beholden sometimes to do things a certain way. The projects we fund, if it is not going to lift up, if we're going to tear down some power structures that have the ability to lift up. So I would hope this lens will be applied from the top to the bottom and horizontally as well, to take a real look at, are we practicing what we are speaking? You know, are we practicing what we preach? And if our communities, and when our folks come into our facilities, are we re-traumatizing them because we are not comfortable with who they are because they don't work here? And, you know, the only way you can be comfortable with folks who don't look like you is you got to be around them, or you got to have somebody around them. And so for people to go into places and not feel welcome and at home, treatment is so much more than taking a pill. So I think that lens needs to be shined from the top to the bottom, from the side and both sides. And organizations see the way that they act, talk, how they spend their money, where they put their time, who they hire. And if they're not hiring people who look like the people that they're serving, there needs to be a serious question of why.
Thank you so much for that, Vanita. And I do want to bring in a question that came into our chat window. Cecilia, you specifically mentioned MIPA, but you also said JIPA, and we had a question come in about JIPA specifically. Would you mind, for the total group, talking a bit about JIPA as well?
Okay, JIPA stands for Greater Involvement of People Living with HIV and AIDS. And it is, you know, like the first principles that was adapted, you know, globally and endorsed by UNAIDS in the mid-90s. And since then, you know, like the JIPA principles evolved into MIPA, which means that we don't just want greater involvement of people living with HIV and AIDS. We want meaningful involvement of people living with HIV and AIDS. And that's how these terminology comes about. And for this racial justice framework, I'm borrowing those terminologies and apply the people of color framework to that.
Thank you so much for that clarification.
And can I
I
say
have, and
something?
go ahead, please, 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 Vanita, go ahead.
And I love that greater involvement, but sometimes, and I know Cecilia know this too, sometimes greater don't mean real. So we also have to find out, you know, they might have a bunch of us and we get to be registration people, we get to greet you at the door, you may have greater numbers, but remember the other side is meaningful. So there's two acronyms that are used. So we want greater and we want meaningful. And the exercise is not a race or gender neutral one. It is not just important that you have greater numbers and they all look alike. So if that greater and that meaningful involvement does not reflect the epidemic, we still got work to do. So not just greater of this and you think you've met it. We want greater meaningful involvement of that's reflected in the epidemic.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Vanita. And I have one more question that I'm going to ask for our panelists, and then I'm going to open it up to respond to you know, some questions that come in. So if you do have a question, please go down to the bottom of your screen, and there's a Q&A button. And some of you are actually sending some stuff through the chat window too. So I'll make sure that I'm looking at that. In addition to that, so if you're on your phone, all you do is tap your screen and the Q&A box should pop up for you. So my final question for, actually I do have a couple. So this question is for Cecilia, and I'm gonna start with you. How do we approach the intersection of racial and gender justice for women of color, from your perspective?
Oh, thank you, Johnny. I think that's really important questions, because when we talk about intersectionalities, we know that, you know, like gender is like the other like big issue that, you know, like we deal with, you know, like even though the world makes up of half of women, we don't see half of the women represented in the movement. So which means that we, you know, like when we look at creating the space, you know, like for racial diversity, we also need gender parity in the movement, you know, and to make sure that there are equal numbers of women of color, like be in leadership positions. And when I say women of color, I'm inclusive of trans women as well.
Thank you so much for that, Cecilia. Vanita, do you have, so when we talk about the intersection of racial and gender justice for women of color, how do you see that us as approaching that?
I like the way Cecilia talked about in the movement. I'm going to talk about it a little bigger, you know. I know it was enlightening to me, and it frustrates me to no end when if I may approach another woman of color and say, why are we so prevalent in the epidemic? And we start mouthing off the answers of our oppressors, the people who are telling us who we are, versus the truth about that this intersection is probably one of the single most reasons that and I tend to say Black women, but definitely Black and brown women of color are so prevalent in the movement. And the way we approach that intersection for us is dealing with color, and living with all of the things that come with color: racism, discrimination, anti-Blackness, all of those things. So imagine one person, I got this is my multiple identities, and then the multiple oppressions that we must deal with, or gender inequality, you know, living in a patriarchal society, you know, a rape culture, you know, there's just so much, never mind pay gap, single parent, mass incarceration, where we've removed men from the home. That intersection has devastating consequences on women of color, that for most who are studying this field would look at it and say, we just don't know how to behave if we would but only put on a condom, when the issue is so much bigger than putting on a condom. So that intersection for us, you know, do we join the feminist movement and say, yay, yay, but my Blackness is over here, or do I go over here? Do I liberate myself at the expense of my Black brother. And trust me, at the first instance, someone's going to remind me I'm Black as well. So that intersection of being a woman of color, a Black woman, and female in this country, in most countries, is the double whammy, those multiple identities and multiple oppressions. Never mind if it's trans, never mind if you have language, never mind if your immigration status, never mind so much more. So the way that we approach that is clearly, I think, thinking individually and seeking to remove some of those levels of oppression that hold people down and keep people sick. And remember that healthcare, education, and all these things are human rights. They're not based on color, language, and none of these things. I could go on, but I'm going to stop. I think you get my point.
Thank you so much for that, Vanita. And my final question for the two of you before I go to some of the questions that are coming in. Vanita, I'll go ahead and start with you for this final question, and that is, what is the role of allies? So our allies, our accomplices, and I listed even our critics, right? Who may not identify as people of color. Like, what is their role in this racial justice movement? In this,
a role of our allies and a role of our critics and accomplices, I'm gonna say. As Octavia would say, we need some people with skin in the game. Our role of our allies is to stand alongside of us, when they're and be willing to deal with some of the things we deal with. Clearly, the skin in the game is where it's different. One of our allies may not be, when they're looking to slash people, you may not be the one fired, you may not be, but we need allies. We cannot win this movement on our own. I wish we could. Our society does not value dark skin or people of color in the same way. And if our allies happen to be white, and I do know tons of white allies who use their privilege for good. They are always calling it out, and they use their privilege for good, and I thank them for it. So there is a role for them. When it comes to who we need to speak, we need someone to stand up and speak as well that looks like the rest of us. Our critics, I hope to only make us better. What you criticize, I'm going to take, and what can we do with that? Is there something we can do it? If not, we just going to make it. I believe it helps us become better. And especially if it's a valid critique, because, we haven't done everything perfect. So I welcome them all. Don't expect, because you're a white ally standing next to me, that society may not give you the same accolades they give me, because I put more on the line to be there. But I damn sure appreciate you standing there with me, and I say thank you. And if you get some skin in the game, we real sisters in the struggle. I'm done.
Thanks, Vanita. Cecilia, for you, what's the role of our allies? Like I said, allies, accomplices, and critics who do not identify as people of color in this movement?
So let's separate the critics and the allies first. I think that, this is going to be a big ask to our allies who are, or I call them white counterparts, to be mindful that, they don't speak for us, but we certainly welcome their inputs and create more spaces for us, to elevate our voices and to speak for ourselves. We would appreciate, our allies to recognize our autonomy and our need to make our own decisions without doing any planning, without consulting us. And for the critics, I think that, we are at a time where, a lot of people have said that, respectability, the politics is dead. Maybe that's true, because we need, white allies to be able to help recognize, these criticism that we get from our critics, and to call out any anti-Blackness and, racist remarks or anti-immigrants remarks, because if we allowed those remarks to continue to foster they will start to grow, and and that's the last things that we want. But most importantly, I think is we can only be safe when our white allies in the room recognize that when we interact with law enforcement, for instance, we get a different response from law enforcement, and those are the times when it'll be really great, and it's a huge ask that our white allies can step in and help to interrupt those interaction.
Good point, Cecilia.
Thank you both so much for participating in the panel portion and so eloquently and expertly asking your questions. I would like to shift a bit to our Q&A component. We do have some questions that have come in, and it does look like we'll be able to get to a few of them. We did get a thank you from one of our attendees as well, to both of you.
Thank you, Dee.
Hey. So I'm going to ask this first question, and let me preface this. There are additional members of our interim steering committee who are on the webinar as well. If you are interested in chiming in response to any of these questions, please ping the panelists so we can bring you in to the dialogue as well. So the first question that came in from Aaron is, thank you for your comments, everyone. In the world of measurable outcomes and the need to show the work that we do to funders, how does a racial justice framework address the need to measure everything we do as required by traditionally funded HIV/AIDS service and prevention organizations? So I want to read that question again, to the need to measure everything that we do as required by traditionally funded HIV service and prevention organizations.
Do you want both of us to answer?
It's up to you. It's certainly you can start, Cecilia, with a response.
I think that it's really important to pay attention to the needs assessments and other service gap analysis out there pertains to people of color, especially when we look at the prevalence and the HIV, the rate of HIV diagnosis amongst people of color, and use those, and trying to start to slowly and gradually incorporate those indicators into the work. A lot of times, when we look at the big pictures, we're looking at really the numbers of the general populations, and not specifically into the people of color. And if we are doing things right, we will see a significant drop in new HIV diagnosis amongst, for instance, Black gay men, and especially, gay youth. And also we will see more of them, getting into care and stay in care. And those are measurable.
Wonderful. And Vanita, if you have a response to that as well, how does a racial justice framework address the need to measure everything that we do as required through traditionally funded HIV/AIDS service and prevention organizations?
I hear what Cecilia said. There's a part of me, and I've done some conversations with funders concerned about AIDS, that we might need to find new ways to measure success, to define success, that it might look a little bit different than what we've traditionally measured success. I'm in Houston. I don't have an ASO that even exists in my city anymore. They're all FQHCs. So the way that we measure success, I think, needs to change. I think, I just don't think we can continue to measure it in the same ways. I think we will get some outcomes, as Cecilia was saying, if we if we shift the way that we look at things and do things from a racial justice perspective. But I also think going down the line, those outcomes may not look like what funders are typically seeing as outcomes. And so I do think we need to be educating funders, which we've done some, about outcomes may look a little bit differently than what they've been in the past. And maybe there are going to be things to measure just besides viral load and CD4 count. You know, there might be other indicators of health that we might need to define. I always say they're running around trying to drive people back into care. We might need to redefine what care really means, and therefore that whatever that measurement shifts. So I don't know what the answer is there, but I just think the way that we measure and the way that we define care is not going to stay the same.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Vanita. And you know, we got a couple of questions. I'm going to, if you both are comfortable with this, I want to bring Max Boykin into this conversation, because Max asked a couple of questions in terms of ways that organizations can use the framework, as well as ways to use the framework in a political context. So if you both are comfortable, I want to bring Max Boykin into the conversation to talk about ways to use the framework, as well as ways to use the framework in the current political context. And I'd like to kind of have some dialogue. And Max is with us.
Come on in, Max.
I'm good, everyone. I'm good. Glad to be a part of the discussion here. One of the things that I think a lot about is when we first created the framework, and questions at my former ASO that I worked at, and even now at the Black AIDS Institute, is how do we use the framework? How is it used in a way? And I think one, actually in the question that was just asked, is actually using the framework also to educate funders on how in which we talk about this. And a big piece that is talked about a lot in the current context of overall health is the use of the term health equity. But you can't talk about health equity without talking about power, and talking about racial discrimination without talking about the other forms of discrimination, homophobia, transphobia, American exceptionalism, a lot of the pieces in which we talked about within the framework. And actually connecting that to when we're trying to measure how health equity comes out in this country. And even the CDC has said, talking about power and its connection to health equity. So you can't actually talk about actually improving people's health without actually talking about power, talking about the pieces in which we brought up within this larger context of like creating healthier societies. And when we talk about ending the HIV epidemic, you're never going to end the epidemic, as they say, without actually addressing power in that context. HIV, criminalization, talking about the different pieces. And that makes, I think it actually forces large ASOs, FQHCs, and other organizations to actually think about, like, what are we doing actually to improve health equity within our community, and not just individuals' health.
Woo!
Thank you so much for that, Max, and thank you for being willing to come into the discussion. And you're welcome to stay. But before we move away from that implementation piece and that focus, so the things that Max mentioned, Cecilia and Vanita, do you have anything to add?
No, I think Max said it all. I'm done.
Okay. This is going to be our final question. I am so sorry, by the way. I'm grateful that we had so many questions coming in. The amazing thing about this is now we have the opportunity to follow up with folks and answer these questions, right? So, this is a really important question, and I'm thoughts on ways to enable incarcerated people of color living with HIV to be meaningfully involved. And Cecilia, I think I want to start with you, and then I'd like to get a response from each of you if you're interested. But what are your thoughts on ways to enable incarcerated people of color living with HIV to be meaningfully involved?
I think that there are many different ways that we're currently using to get people living with HIV involved. Like for instance, the Zero Project has a publications that goes out to all people living with HIV behind bars. And I think that, that would be a good place to start if organizations have like informations and articles, like I think that Zero Project would be would welcome, like your input and also your contributions to the next publications that they're going to distribute into the prison system. At the Zero Project, what we were able to accomplish is that we actually also have a person who's behind bars and who participates in our board meetings, and and that's just like requires some coordination like with the prison staff. And we're not the only one, by the way, that have people behind bars getting involved like in leadership process. There are other organizations that also have this model as well. And I think that, it's also important to really remember that a lot of people that you see on the outside have been behind bars too. And the rate of recidivism for, especially for, people of color is much higher than white folks. And, and those are also the opportunities for us to reach out and engage them in these dialogues. And in some ways, maybe we can even train them, like to be peer leaders, like, and heaven forbid if they actually got incarcerated again, at least they will bring with them, the resources that they have learned and share that with their prison mates. And I think that, this is really, like, an ongoing process, like hopefully we can also challenge, like the prison industrial complex and, and help more people to get out of prison and jails rather than getting in.
Thank you so much. Vanita, anything you'd like to add in terms of ways to engage people of color who may be incarcerated, who are living with HIV to be meaningfully involved?
I had this, well, I liked all the ones Cecilia mentioned. When I think of MIPA and JIPA, greater involvement, what ways that they can really control the agenda setting and all of that. Clearly somebody's got to come in and help them with that. But I had this real novel idea the other day. I didn't understand why, because you're behind bars, you couldn't vote. So I had this grand idea that we need to give the vote to people behind bars too. They didn't give up their citizenship. And so somebody kind of said, Vanita, find a new cause. Greater involvement of people. So one of the things they're doing here in Houston is we've created something. There's a small blue book that lists all the services. It's typically a bigger version, and we've created for the last, I don't know, 5 years or so, a version of that they distribute inside prisons, and so that folks can have access to services when they get out. Is it good? Yeah, I think it probably helps, but I do think there still needs to be a little bit more transition. One other thing we're thinking about doing here, we're trying to have a one-stop drop-in place, so all agencies that have something to do with services be co-located in one place, so that when folks are released, they have one-stop drop to get things done. We have issues around identification. You can't go for services, you don't have an ID. And we're trying to push to have that booking number be used as that piece of paper be used as a form of identification. So in other words, so people can access services. Those are all just kind of treating the symptom and all that. So I think there needs to be a lot more, but that's just where we are right now.
Wonderful. And Max, in say our last minute or two, do you have anything you'd like to add to enable incarcerated people of color who may be living with HIV to be more meaningfully involved?
So a couple of things that come to mind first is, as Vanita said, is making sure that they have access to voting. We have live in a lot of states that folks were formerly incarcerated or incarcerated and actually have not been charged with a crime, do not have that access to vote. And I know in Chicago, they just did a recently really good push of people in Cook County Jail of making sure that they actually were registered to vote. You have organizations such as Black and Pink who have done a lot of work to make sure. And if maybe it's not always HIV organizations, but looking at other organizations and larger social justice movement to also help and support that, such as Black and Pink. You have organizations like the Men and Women's Prison Ministry in Illinois, who does a lot of work, and making sure that they hire people who are formerly incarcerated, because no one knows better to actually help those that are actually currently incarcerated and what they're dealing with, and people who have been dealing with it, lived inside, and know how in which they're treated. Making sure that we put them within leadership within organizations. And then even if you don't have the opportunity to always hire people, putting them within your cabs. And as really important understanding, like, how in which we're actually helping supporting those folks, because it's important. If we actually want to end the epidemic, we have to talk about everyone. I also want to bring up within that, also talking about sex workers who also have to deal with that incarceration or dealing with ICE, and making sure that we also make sure that their voices are heard when we're moving forward in this, and making sure, again, part of CABS, part of leadership, we don't want to fake like we're actually helping them, but actually making sure that their voices are heard as we move forward with these particular movements.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. So thank you to Vanita Ray and Cecilia Chung and Max Boykin for jumping on and joining us. And I am right now, folks, I'm saving the chat, and we're going to save these questions because we had some amazing questions and some comments that came through, and we want to be able to follow up with folks. So, but before I end this webinar, there's some people I want to shout out. Olivia Ford is on this webinar somewhere, and Olivia was instrumental and led the process for this framework being what it is. So I want to shout out Olivia and her amazing work of leading us through the writing of this. And I also want to thank Marco Castro Boyorquez, who translated with his team this framework into Spanish. So when you visit the website to download the framework, you actually will also be able to download a copy of the framework in Spanish as well. And Marco and his folks were so amazing at that. And so, once again, I want to thank everybody for joining us and learning a bit about our framework and HIV Racial Justice Now. And please visit the website where the framework is located. I put that link in the chat box. I'm going to put it there again so that people can copy it. But you can also join our mailing list there and stay in touch with what's happening with the group. And it's a great way to stay engaged. So thank you everyone for joining us on this webinar today, and have a great rest of your day, everybody. Thanks.
Thank you, Johnny.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Awesome.